That food that you absolutely love and crave, is it true that it's almost impossible to eat just one? Guess what my topic today is? I want to cover the topic of food addiction. So, if you've been following me, this is in a series based on eating disorders and disordered eating. Now, the first two videos that I did were based on diet culture and wellness culture and how I felt that they could be just contributing to some disordered eating patterns. So, as we continue, if you've missed anything or want to go back or feel like you want to fill in the gaps that maybe I missed, you can definitely click on the link in the video description to the accompanying article, and it will provide you with all those resources and references, and you can totally geek out there and catch up if you missed any of these. So I did want to start there, and I think it's important for me to say that we need to understand the wellness and diet culture, because in order to understand when we're labeling something as an addiction or a mental health issue, we want to address the cultural, the sociological, and the psychological context and belief systems that that behavior or that mindset is stemming from. Okay, so if we live in a culture like right now where we're living in a diet culture and a wellness culture, and it's coming into healthcare, where certain foods are deemed as quote unquote good and certain foods are deemed as bad, and certain behaviors and restrictive patterns are almost looked up to and exalted, it makes it almost impossible to escape that people are going to respond to this, and maybe not necessarily in the most productive ways, right? So right now we've been coming out of a major trauma. I'm recording this in 2022, and the world has seemed out of control for a lot of people. So psychologically, it makes sense that if we can control a little part of our world, maybe our food, right, or what we eat or put in our bodies, place it in little neat categories of black and white or good and bad, can almost make someone feel like they have a focus. They don't have to feel totally out of control with the rest of the world swirling around them. But I also think that this can be very dangerous because it's not getting to the root issue of someone's coping ability, their resiliency, and how they can nourish and make peace and nurture their body to make it healthier so that they can live a thriving, wonderful life where they're not obsessively focusing on their health, but using health as a means to live their life on purpose and within their values. So there's the difference and there's the caveats. So with that in mind, when we are looking at this topic, which I am very passionate about, we have to keep in mind that some of these restrictive behaviors, some of these extreme elimination of certain food groups, and some of these disordered eating behavioral patterns, such as not going to events where certain foods are and actually avoiding those events because they're scared someone will partake in a behavior that they don't want to do, which almost meets some of the criteria for obsessive compulsive disorder, right? Because that's where the avoidance comes in, are being normalized and even exalted in the wellness community in certain things. So labeling eating disorders or food addiction, I think we have to be very careful of, because some may feel that if we label it as an addiction, it could clear the stigma of viewing people as lazy and lacking willpower if they have larger bodies or overconsume food. Other people feel it may actually cause more eating disorders, more restraint, and increased prejudice of those who lack control. And in my other videos, I talked about when we go on restrictive diets and people hold on to them for a long period of time, weight regain almost always results. So even if we're doing these societal accepted disordered eating patterns of restriction, most likely people aren't going to get the results that they think and are promised for by these behavioral patterns. So again, we need to be very cautious and careful in labeling certain types of food or behaviors as quote unquote addictive. Just like alcohol or any substance of abuse, it's not actually the substance that's the issue, right? It's looking at what are these intricate factors, all of these multifactorial aspects that lead someone to be addicted. Okay, so it's not just genetics, it's not just environmental, it's not just mental, it's not just the substance. It's everything all together. And as a naturopath and functional medicine doctor, we want to look at the whole picture, not just blame the food or the person, right? So in 2016, I stepped into wellness culture and was very steeped into it and into diet culture. And I did a series on, are we addicted to food and why we are addicted to food? And in that, I talked about the evidence that was being presented in favor of that people can be addicted to food. Now, later on, when I had been more into health at every size and body acceptance, I did more of the caveats and the cons and the arguments against food addiction. So I want to go through those with you, and I've updated some of those points. And then later on, I'm going to do another video where I dive deeper into the topic of food addiction, look at some current reviews and clinical considerations for diagnostic criteria so that you have a full awareness of what is going on in our culture and you can be an empowered consumer. And I'm also hoping that practitioners will keep this in mind when we are discussing how to nurture and care for our bodies with our clients and our patients, and how we can use this information to make sure that our biases and triggers aren't perpetuating dysfunctional eating patterns in our patients and in our clients. Okay, so let me go through some of the evidence that is presented and is in the literature that supports the belief that food can be addictive. Okay, so there's this whole concept of hyperpalatability, and this is where food science kind of gathers together different qualities of food to make them very, very rewarding, very pleasurable, and light up those different centers in the brain. So it's hard for someone to stop eating them. Makes complete sense on the marketing end, right? The more potato chips you sell, the richer that person gets in selling potato chips. So why not make them taste good? We also have small studies in dieters and food restrictors that demonstrate that certain foods do trigger dopamine response and changes in brain chemicals. So we know dopamine is a reward, it's a pleasure-seeking neurotransmitter. It helps with focus and motivation and drive. Okay, we have seen how deregulation in different hormonal signals of hunger, satiety, regulation of storage of body fat, such as leptin and ghrelin and insulin, can lead to imbalanced eating patterns. So we have a physiological mechanism which can lead to a behavioral response, which can also be found in addictive patterns. Now, we also know that these combination of hormonal shifts, genetic predisposition, and changes in reward symptoms related to the substance is very similar to some of the risk factors for addictions, right? We have also seen specific areas in brain that are activated in response to appetizing foods or food cues. So we look at the dorsal striatum, the insula, the orbitofrontal cortex, the amygdala, the nucleus accumbens, the substantia nigra, the ventral tegmental area, and the lateral hypothalamus. Repeat that 5 times, right? But it shows that various responses in those areas are related to food cues, and that different neurotransmitters and hormonal signals in the pathways of those brains can also act to increase or decrease food behavior. We've also seen some evidence that those diagnosed with quote unquote obesity experience dysregulated brain stress and deficiency in these inhibitory food responses. So kind of where they're finding differences in people, say, that are alcoholic than in normal drinkers, we're seeing some of that in people who are larger body size, according to this literature, the selected literature. And studies have also demonstrated that incentives for sugar could be regulated by these emotional circuitries in the brain that trump somebody's ability to override that and control their eating response. So it does sound pretty impressive, right? That food can for sure be addictive. We have some neurophysiological patterns, and we have some correlational links to addictive behaviors, right? Based on these multifactorial aspects. But step back, because according to a current status of evidence for a new diagnosis literature review, that's the name of the study. It's a 2021 article, and they talk about 5 dimensions that are important to delineate an addiction or such a disorder as food addiction. There has to be an agreed upon clinical criteria for diagnosis, one or more validated instruments for the qualification of this disorder severity, epidemiological data, say that 5 times fast, evidence for a specific pathophysiology and available treatments. So I'm going to go through this in the next video in more depth later and look at the limitations that currently exist within labeling food as an addiction. For now, I'll just say specifically the criteria and the clinical trials for available treatments are lacking and have not been met for food addiction. And we also don't have a set upon validated instrument so far. There's been various instruments that they've used to prove food addiction. It has not been agreed upon right now, okay? So it's important to remember this. Now I want to talk to you a little bit about the caveats of labeling food as addiction. So some of these studies have had their flaws. For example, many of the studies didn't account for the fact that participants in the study were coming in from a place of food restriction. So this makes foods that are more hypopalatable more rewarding based on the psychological drive and deprivation. If you haven't had chocolate for a while, what happens, or if you see a kid and their parents are super strict on what they can and can't eat, and then you have a kid whose parents are super strict and relaxed around food, I bet you can predict the behavior of those 2 kids when they're both in front of the same quote unquote junk food. The kid that has been presented with that food, no shame, no restriction, is going to say, it's food. I'll have this. If I want it, I won't. The other kid's going to be party time, right? It's a psychological response in the brain. I've had, and I'll just say this from anecdotal evidence, personal experience, and with my clients, we've kind of embraced this intuitive eating philosophy, as well as the belief that some of the overconsumption of food that can look like binging is based on some restriction. And that when we've removed the shame around these quote unquote addicted foods and allowed people to nourish and find peace with their bodies and what they wanted out of their life for health, regardless of where their body shape and weight ended up, that led them to the ability to eat quote unquote food they were addicted to with moderation. So I've just found that interesting in what I've done for the past, since I've done this 2016. So the past the past 6 years. There's been studies with rats who eat sugar, and some of the rats were allowed to eat sugar ad lib whenever they wanted it. Some of the rats were deprived of it and only allowed of it at certain times. The rats who were free range of sugar, they were normal sized and able to moderate intake. The rats that had their access to the sugar cut off binged on it when they finally got their furry little paws on it. Now, food, just like sex, relationships, and film, is meant to be pleasurable. These different pleasure activities also light up pleasurable reward cycles in the brain, especially after times of deprivation. So anything could be addictive if we use pleasure as a measure of measuring addiction. So we need to keep that in mind as well. And then there's the whole aspect of shaming and weight stigma that we need to be aware of in the first place. Adding food addiction to that label as a mental health with fat bias, and I say fat as a descriptor, not as a derogatory term, that could be really damaging. So I think it's important now that we've reviewed some of the neurophysiology as well as the psychology around food restriction, food addiction, and also some of the caveats to some of the quote proof of food addiction, we have to take this in context in the culture and wellness communities that we are embedded in right now. It's easy to point blame at any type of food, and I'll get into that a little more in the next video. But remember, to me, that's superficial, because one, patterns with food intake are based on, like I said, a variety of extremely complex aspects: genetic predisposition, food and health history, culture, environmental exposures, socioeconomic background, access to the food, brain health, stress resiliency, ability to cope with emotional triggers, among many others. So I'm not saying that we should promote eating foods that are highly processed, which hurt the environment and lack nourishment for our brains and bodies. As a naturopathic doctor, I do uphold the belief that food can be medicine. I do feel that personalized diets that help people see what foods are best for their brains and bodies can impact mental, emotional, and physical health for the better. I even do genetic variation in individuals and optimize hormonal balance and overall wellness to optimize how their food is processed. That being said, I do feel that demonizing foods and eating practices using shame, blame, and morality is extremely damaging mentally, and this can lead to physical issues, okay? So as the science evolves around the topic of eating addiction, we need to hold it tenderly, and we need to keep it in context of, if we're going to place another label of on someone, how are we going to do this in a way that's healing? And I do feel we need to walk lightly and acknowledge that if we're not careful, this kind of branding could lead to more harm and fuel more eating disorders. I'm also pleading with healthcare providers to be aware of the potential dangers of mental health labels without the actual science being settled yet, because at the time of this video, it isn't settled, and there is no agreed upon food addiction criteria. So we have to not confuse our opinions and biases and selective literature citations as final proof. We need to get in all different communities, including the psychological and psychiatric communities, into this picture here. Consumers, you are not alone. Just be mindful and be aware of what you are believing and practicing with your body and with your health. And if you feel that food is causing you undue distress, you're thinking about it all the time, what you should and what you shouldn't eat, if it's affecting your life to the point where you can't go somewhere freely because you're afraid of food, I'm telling you, I don't think that that's okay. I don't. And I think that I urge you to find an eating disorder specialist, and especially one who is awake to the dangers of food and diet culture restriction and how that could trigger you, and get some help. Okay. So I probably am going to get some feedback on this video, because I know this is a hot topic, and many of my respected colleagues who I completely think are brilliant really believe in food addiction, and that if we got rid of processed food, this problem of people consuming foods that quote unquote are unhealthy would go away. I think it's too simple. That's too simple. So I've explored that in this video, and then I'll explore it again in the next video even further. And I would love to hear from you and what you think about this topic. I know it might not make me the most popular naturopath, because, hey, weight loss and food addiction are the cool topics. And if you can show somebody how to control it, it might make them feel good. But again, I think there's dangers in that. So let me know what you think, and please comment. And also, if you like the way I go about things, my mind body practice, or you want to learn more, be sure to check the resources in the video. I have a ton of free resources on essential oils, on lifestyle, and I have classes you can take on mind body essential oils for both consumers and for practitioners. So thank you again for joining me, and I will be back to discuss the second part of food addiction, and I love and can't wait to hear your response. Take care.